Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you're here. I'm Reverend Bruce Lamb, the Minister of Faith Formation at the Riverside Church, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Forbidden Black Love, America's Hidden Civil Rights Issue. Today, we are thrilled to be joined by Dr. Dianne Stuart, sharing insights from her new book, Black Women, Black Love, and she'll be in conversation today with Riverside member Dr. Andrea White. So today I want to welcome both Dr. Stewart and Dr. White. First, begin by telling you a little bit about Dr. Stewart. Huge congratulations. Dr. Stewart is the newly promoted professor of religion and African American studies at Emory University. And I invite you to follow her on Twitter, and I'll put her Twitter handle at Dianne M. Stewart in the chat. She recently announced her promotion on Friday, and it now has over 26,000 likes. So that's really, really amazing. And she also mentioned, I wanted to be sure and point this out, that she joins the ranks of 2,900 Black women in America who also hold a title, I believe, a professor. So we're so happy for Dr. Stewart. Congratulations to you for this promotion. And Dr. Stewart's research has been supported by the Fulbright Scholar Program, the Bill and Carol Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry, and the American Academy of Religion. She is the author of Three Eyes for the Journey, African Dimensions of the Jamaican Religious Experience by Oxford University Press in 2005, Black Women, Black Love, America's War on African American Marriage that just came out in 2020 in October, and also Abadiah Orisa and Religious Identity in Trinidad, Africana Nationalisms and the Power of Black Sacred Imagination. And that's forthcoming in 2022. Her work has also been published in the Washington Post and other outlets. Beyond her research in Trinidad and Jamaica, Dr. Stewart has studied and conducted research and lectured in a number of African, Latin American, and Caribbean countries, including the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, the Republic of Benin, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, Guatemala, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Bermuda. Dr. Stewart has also served on several committees within the American Academy of Religion. She serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Africana Religions, the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, and the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion. She's also a founding co-editor with Jacob Olpana and Terrence Johnson of the Religious Cultures of African and African Diaspora People series at Duke University Press. We are so happy to welcome Dr. Stewart here today, and also in conversation with our own Dr. Andrea C. White, is a member of Riverside Church and a professor at Union Theological Seminary, the professor of theology and culture at Union Seminary right next door to Riverside. And Dr. White has served as the executive director of the Society for the Study of Black Religion and chair of the Black Theology Unit for the American Academy of Religion. And Dr. White's research specializes in womanist theology and critical theory, philosophy of religion, and fenomenology. Her forthcoming volume is The Scandal of Flesh, Black Women's Bodies, God, and Politics. She is also the author of The Back of God, A Theology of Otherness, and Karl Barth and Paul Ricoeur, and editor of several future volumes, including Political Theology on Edge with Catherine Keller and Clayton Crockett, and The State of Black Theology. We're so glad to welcome Dr. Stewart and Dr. White to be with us here today. Dr. Stewart's book is Black Women, Black Love, and I encourage you to buy it and read it if you haven't already. I've read it twice now. It's very good, and commend it all to you. So without further ado, let us give a warm Riverside welcome to Dr. Andrea White and Dr. Dianne Stuart. Many thanks to you both. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Bruce. Thank you so very much for introducing both of us. I'm so excited to have the amazing, phenomenal Dr. Dianne Stuart with us today. I have to share with you that I met my very first conversation actually with Dianne was in September 2015. I had just arrived at Emory University where I used to teach. And I said 2015, I meant 2008. 2008, it was that long ago. And I remember being in Party City shopping for my two girls for their birthday parties. And I did not leave Party City for another hour, hour and a half because Dianne Stuart called me and we were on the phone in our very first conversation forever. And I feel like we haven't stopped talking since. I'm so excited to be in conversation with her. You're gonna absolutely love this book if you haven't read it yet. And it's just so appropriate to be able to talk about this on Valentine's Day. Um, so thank you, thank you, thank you, Dianne, for being with us. And I must also share, Dianne is an alum of Union Theological Seminary, where I now teach here in New York City, as Bruce mentioned, next door to Riverside. And I want to give a shout out to some folks who are with us from the Black Women's Caucus from Union. So thank you for being with us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dianne.
Thank you so much. I am so delighted to be here as a graduate of Union. While I was at Union studying for my PhD, I visited Riverside several times, and it's always been such a robust, welcoming, progressive community. So I am truly honored to be hosted today by Riverside. Thank you, Reverend Bruce Lamb, and thank you, Dr. Andrea White, for setting this up, for arranging everything, and for hosting me. Um, Dr. White, since you started with shout outs, I cannot help myself. Martha Wiggins is on this call. I just see the name. I adore you, Reverend Dr. Martha Wiggins, or maybe it's just
Hi,
Dr. Martha
Dianne.
Wiggins.
Hi.
Oh my goodness. I've been trying to find your phone number for ages. Please find me and email me.
I will
I
do that.
I am so delighted that you're here, and others of you. I'm just kind of looking to see if I see anyone else I know. I'm not sure, but thank you. I would love to begin by reading from the first chapter of my book. It's called Jumping the Broom: Racial Slavery and the Roots of Forbidden Black Love. And I'm gonna put these glasses on so I can really see well. Never marry again in slavery. A peculiar piece of advice, poetic in its brevity and clarity. No other arrangement of 5 common words could better reveal the contradictions confining enslaved Black women's options for sustained romantic love and marriage during their years of bondage in this country. When 24-year-old Margaret Peggy Garner uttered these words to her husband Robert on her deathbed, she certainly was not the first among Black women in America to change her mind about the benefits of marriage while legally enslaved. The singular message gleaned from the initial 250-year period of Black involuntary presence in this country is that slavery constituted the first battlefield in America's war on African American marriage, making marriage unstable and unworkable for millions of African descendants. This fact must be tempered, however, by testaments of bondpersons' inscrutable capacity to make a way out of no way. In the thick of their daily battle for love, not all vanquished by slavery succumbed to the forces bent on destroying their bonds of affection. Undeniably, a good number accommodated the spoken and unspoken rules of forbidden Black love, but some fled north to pursue Black love. Some chose enslavement over manumission to preserve Black love. Others sacrificed their lives for Black love. and some, like Margaret Garner, killed in the name of Black love. Margaret initially began her northward quest not to kill, but to pursue unfettered Black love, self-love, love of her husband, Robert Simon Jr., of her family, and of course, of freedom. On January 27, 1856, after fleeing bondage in northern Kentucky, the Garners, their 4 children, Robert's parents, Simon Sr. and Mary, and 9 friends from neighboring farms traversed a frozen Ohio River and separated into smaller units. The 3 generations of the Garner family remained together and sought refuge at the home of Margaret's uncle, Joe Kite. Within hours, their hopes of securing freedom farther north were thwarted, as slave catchers and US Marshals hunted them down and surrounded the house with reinforcements. Robert, however, not only had left Kentucky with his master's horses, but also had taken his gun and used it in the showdown with authorities. Defending his family's liberty, Robert discharged his weapon and wounded 1 or more of his opponents, while his pregnant wife killed their 2-year-old daughter and injured their other children as she attempted to kill them and herself. At this critical crossroads, Margaret was forced to choose between surrendering her children to a world of unending horrors or fleeing from it eternally. Although outnumbered and overpowered by their opponents, Margaret achieved a measure of victory in sparing at least one of her children from returning to slavery's stranglehold. Margaret's Black maternal actions can only be understood through the prism of slave life. One contemporary newspaper reported that Margaret, quote, and the others complained about cruel treatment on the part of their master and alleged that as the cause of their attempted escape, end of quote. Margaret certainly had revealing scars to this effect. "White man struck me," was all she said in response to inquiries about what had to have been flesh wounds that left such glaring imprints on her left cheek and temple. Convincing evidence, if not outright proof, also suggests that Margaret endured repeated sexual violation at the hands of her master, Archibald Gaines, or another white man. And her 2 fair-skinned children were believed to be sired by Gaines. The man with the most access to Margaret, even more than her husband, who lived about a mile away from Gaines's Maplewood farm. Although identified as chestnut brown, Margaret and a Negro, Robert, their children, Mary and Scylla, were described as near white in complexion. That Gaines insisted to deputies dispatched to recover his human property that, quote, "no harm whatsoever should be done the little children," end of quote, conveys an emotional investment in their well-being, atypical of a slaveholder with no blood ties to the fugitive children he owned. While we may never know for certain whether Gaines sexually assaulted Margaret, we do know that with only seconds to act decisively and successfully, Margaret zeroed in on slaughtering her girl child first. Cutting her throat 5 inches long and 3 inches deep from ear to ear, Margaret ensured that 2-year-old Mary would not return to the physical, sexual, and reproductive violation awaiting her at the Maplewood farm. Margaret had apparently attempted to kill all 4 of her children on that dreadful day of reckoning. After the family was apprehended, her sons, Tommy and Sammy, ages 6 and 4 respectively, were found with knife wounds across their backs and shoulders. And her infant daughter, Scylla, had sustained a blow to the head and shoulders. A blow to the head from a shovel. However, something telling remains with Margaret's infanticidal wishes and filicidal act concerning her 2 girl children. A local minister, Reverend P.C. Bassett from Cincinnati Fairmount Theological Seminary, interviewed Margaret after Mary's death during which she denied any mention that she was temporarily insane. I was as cool as I now am, and would much rather kill them at once and thus end their sufferings than have them taken back to slavery and be murdered by piecemeal. According to Bassett, quote, she then told the story of her wrongs. She spoke of her days of unmitigated toil, of her nights of suffering while the bitter tears coursed their way down her cheeks. End of quote. Another curious detail about Margaret's daughters might help answer the question of how Margaret suffered under cover of night. Her two near white girls and the baby she was carrying at the time of her recapture were conceived during the exact periods when Gaines's wife, Elizabeth, was pregnant and unable to engage in sexual relations with her husband without endangering her and her unborn baby's health. 2 years after the Garner family's dreadful episode, tuberculosis finally granted Margaret the death she had long preferred to enslavement. She was survived by her husband and 2 sons. Married bondpersons like Robert and Margaret experienced a peculiar type of spousal abuse at the hands of the slaveocracy, forced to suffer as powerless bystanders at scenes of their wives and husbands being beaten, raped, verbally threatened, and subjected to other unforgettable injuries. In an interview, Robert's mother, Mary, who described herself as, quote, a mother of 8 children, most of whom have been separated from her, confessed that, quote, her husband was once separated from her 25 years, during which time she did not see him. And could she have prevented it, she would never have permitted him to return, as she did not wish him to witness her sufferings or be exposed to the brutal treatment that he would receive, end of quote. The emasculating shame Simon Sr. and Robert suffered while married to women they could not defend against the humiliating and torturous assaults they witnessed undoubtedly led Robert to the same conclusion his wife expressed: never marry again in slavery. When Robert did remarry, it was not until after emancipation.
Dianne, thank you for that gripping opening of your book. It's so powerful, and what a way to start the conversation. Throughout the book, you take up these deep, deep intimacies of Black women's lives and the tragic stories of trauma, but also stories of resilience. And the book reads really quite personally, although there are only a few autobiographical moments in Black women, Black love. It reads like a deeply personal story. So I'd like to ask, how did you come to write this book, and why is this topic important to you? The force of personal conviction comes through every page. So I'd like to know how it got started.
Thank you. Andrea, in 2003, I was doing research for a new course I was developing simply called Black Love. I was trained by James Cone. He was my advisor at Union. Dolores Williams was also very crucial to my education, as well as James Washington, Vincent Wimbush, Beverly Harrison, and other scholars. And one of the things that I began to realize after about maybe 5 or 6 years of teaching, I began teaching in 1997, was that, Dr. Cone had always said that there are 5 themes that emerge time and again in African-American history, African-American religious history in particular: suffering, hope, justice, love, and freedom. And I realized that as Black theologians, womanist theologians, liberation theologians, we often focus on the 4 of those themes, but we don't focus a lot on love. And so I decided to create a new course called Black Love. I wanted to focus on love. Well, it turns out that to talk about Black love does mean really engaging with all of those other themes, including suffering and trauma and all of that, because we have to talk about lovelessness in the African American experience as well. But in getting ready for that class, I was going back and forth in my mind about whether to include a section on romantic love. And at that point, I was particularly looking at heterosexual coupling. And my TA was the one who really convinced me. I didn't want students to not take the class seriously, so I snuck it in at the very tail end. As I began to do research on the subject, I was floored. I was just totally floored by what the data were saying. I had been in conversations my entire adult life since college about inadequate opportunities for Black women to find love, to partner, and to marry, especially with Black men. But seeing it in print, seeing the studies really impacted me. And while social scientists tend to focus on barriers to love and marriage in the African American experience from the period of the 1960s when marriage rates really began to drop for African American families, I felt that we needed to look at this as a longer phenomenon. And I wanted to take the analysis all the way back to slavery. So I began at the beginning. And what I really left this research convicted about was that we have to talk about this issue as the civil rights issue it is. Marriage is a civil right. We experience it very personally and very intimately, so we don't often talk about it that way. But African Americans gained the right to marry in 1865 with the passing of the 13th Amendment. And yes, it is true that many married during slavery, although many marriages were disrupted due to the domestic slave trade. Many married during slavery, but their marriages were not legally recognized, and they certainly did not have the legal right to marry until the 13th Amendment was passed. So when I compare what I was working on to the kinds of materials that are available to a wide public, not just to academic audiences, I didn't see anyone working on this problem based on the systemic and structural barriers to love and marriage for Black women. Usually the conversation focuses on self-help approaches, advice for Black women, strategies that Black women can deploy to make themselves more appealing in a depleted marriage market and dating market. And so I wanted to call attention to the Black community, to America, to the nation at large, that this is actually a civil rights issue. Marriage is a civil right. And for all intents and purposes, Black women are being denied too much access to exercise that civil right. And so that's where it gets very personal for me. And so I think one way audiences can approach my book is by understanding that I am purposefully giving attention to narratives and data that show how racist and sexist laws, policies, institutions, and cultural attitudes have placed barriers between Black women and experiences of enduring love and marriage across the centuries.
Thanks for that. You spoke about the class where this was born, your class on Black love. I happen to know from firsthand experience that you are a phenomenal teacher and you're deeply invested in student learning. So I'd love you to tell us about your course, Black love, and what are some memorable moments that you've had with students as you were working through these issues? What class discussions stayed with you as you were writing?
Yeah, no, I love talking about that class. I've only taught it. I've only had 3 iterations of the course, and it changed significantly since I taught it in 2004. I taught it again in 2016. It was a time in our nation, as we're experiencing now, of student activism, explosive student activism. For a long time, since I began teaching in 1997, I used to say to my colleagues, "Why are all the professors more radical than the students?" It just seemed like, we were so radical in the 80s and the 90s when I was in college, right? Protesting what was going on in South Africa, divesting. And, when I entered the professoriate, I just felt that my students were much more oriented toward following more capitalist oriented agendas, getting credentialed so that they could advance their careers. And it just took years upon years to see students radicalized on campuses again. And I mean radicalized in a good way. And so Black students were very upset in particular about the death of Trayvon Martin. And they were depleted. I am a professor that's very approachable. They were often coming to me angry, full of rage, not knowing exactly how to direct that rage toward affirming and purposeful activity. And so I felt that it was time for a new iteration of the Black Love course. And so the course has always focused on a range of Black intellectuals and thinkers across a number of topics. And so Bell Hooks is like an anchoring scholar for the course, and particularly her book, Salvation. Audre Lorde is also a very important anchoring scholar. In fact, I tell the students that Lorde, through her analysis of the erotic, offers us the best avenue, the best way to begin to develop what Layli Mapayan calls technologies of love in her womanist work. And so we start with them, and we engage with Howard Thurman, Martin Luther King Jr. We look at what it means to have the strength to love one's enemy in the middle of the civil rights movement. We look at also Malcolm X and Black Power movement advocates and writings about self-love. What does it take to love oneself in America and in the world? So we work through those things, but we also look at family love. In 2016, and it's been really successful, I added a unit, and I work with a colleague who's a specialist in this area on what happens to us when we fall in love in terms of neurochemical processes in the body. What it's called the brain in love. What happens to our brains when we fall in love? And so that's been very, very exciting. We also look at parental love, and we look at Black feminism and womanism and love. We look at Black masculinity and love. LGBTQ issues are not just a section; they are interwoven throughout the entire class. And even though my emphasis on romantic love works with data pertaining to heterosexual coupling and marriage, I think after the 2020 census, I can expand that, because the 2020 census has collected data on same-sex coupling and love. So we'll see what happens there. But it's a very exciting class. We also look at pop culture and love. We've looked at issues around the sex industry, for example, film and media, and images of Black love in the media, heterosexual coupling and same-sex coupling. So it's a very robust, it's a very full course. In terms of the discussions that stayed with me, well, one thing that I found in the class, and even in my general discussions with Black female students in the academy, they're not so interested or focused on marriage. That's not their concern, but they're very interested and concerned about dating. No matter what their sexual orientation is, they're very interested and concerned about dating. When I talk with heterosexual Black women who are undergraduates, they're concerned about the fact that many Black men are interested in dating white women or racially ambiguous women, and they feel rejected. And I often tell them, I remember the same conversation when I was in college. It's almost as if nothing has changed. At least at that evolutionary, at least at that stage of their development, in college, it seems like this phenomenon continues. So that's something that stayed with me as I was writing. The other thing is that Black men seem a little bit more uneasy with the conversation. My Black male college students seem a little bit more uneasy, and my other college students, Asian, white, they seem very interested in just learning about the conversation and about the materials. The other thing that stuck with me were discussions about different approaches to marriage, traditional Western approaches versus traditional African and Asian approaches. We had very robust robust conversations about those different approaches, whether arranged marriages, in the widest sense of the word, are helpful or useful, even in Western culture. So those discussions especially stayed with me.
Yeah, thanks. I'll ask you just a couple more questions and then we'll open it up for Q&A with everyone who's with us so that I don't hog you up with my questions. But I want to ask you about patriarchy. When you write about patriarchy, you explain that patriarchy is not African patriarchy and it's not God's patriarchy, but as you so powerfully put it, it is white America's patriarchy, the Black community's entrance fee to the dark margins of national belonging. You say this on page 195. You talk about how it's embedded in Black culture, most especially in the Black church. Black male pastors, you write, quote, are the most ardent pushers of patriarchy in the Black community. And I know you weren't necessarily referring to Michael Livingston, our senior minister, who's on the in the class with us right now. Michael, you're excluded from this question. But anyway, you discuss the uncritical reading of biblical texts, and we know from your biography that you're a religion scholar. If you were to, and we also know, being trained by James Cone and Dolores Williams, that you're also a theologian, you're a womanist scholar. And if you were to add a full chapter on religion, what might you include in it? What is forbidden Black love? How is forbidden Black love also a theological problem?
Oh, that's a great question, a very important question, because the institution of Christianity has been one of the most powerful structures that has harmed Black love and marriage over the centuries. And I think it's hard for Christians to hear this, but it's certainly true that Christianity was deeply intertwined with slavery and the conditions of slavery that prohibited Black love and marriage. And I know theologically, as a student of James Cone, whom I loved, I adored my advisor, I must say that, liberation theologians would say that wasn't Christianity at all. That was the abuse of Christianity. But I'm going to talk now as a historian, that the phenomenon itself, the tradition, the institutional church was deeply intertwined with slavery, and the conditions that interfered with Black relationships, with Black freedom. So I would include a section on this history, and I would spend perhaps even more time on a subsequent section exposing the impact of Christian missionary activities in the South among ex-enslaved populations during Reconstruction, and even after, when missionaries and the institutional church were determined to re-educate African descendants, right, to relinquish their creative, flexible cultural approaches to courtship, marriage, and family. And the missionaries understood their approaches, African-descended approaches, as unchristian and uncivilized. These customs would never make African Americans fit for authentic inclusion and authentic citizenship in the United States. So they had to be socialized out of this. And this happened in the historically Black colleges that were established by many of these Christian institutions. And we can look at the establishment of these schools as something, as a good for the Black community. But what kind of education did they receive in those institutions relative to how those students should approach or think about the African heritage that they had inherited, right? Especially around issues of courtship and marriage. And then in conversations with missionaries and other, or classes with missionaries in other contexts, it's really important to understand that history. It's very important to understand that after slavery, the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established to reconstruct the South, to create new institutions and restore a life for newly freed African Americans and poor whites, insisted across the board that the only way Black women could get work was through her husband's authority and approval. So this was new for Black women. This was totally new. Black women were liberated after slavery to enter patriarchal marital arrangements that were Anglo-American. And the Freedmen's Bureau would not allow Black women to have contracts of their own. Their husbands, they had to be navigated and negotiated through their husbands, because the Euro-Western approach to marriage was based on the doctrine of coverture, a doctrine that says you bond, you become one, you basically melt into your husband's identity as a woman when you marry, and your husband controls all property, all contract, all labor, is the final arbiter of everything that happens in that marriage. And so Black people were socialized to accept these arrangements for marriage. And some Black women protested. I mean, one of the things we see is Black women got married in wide numbers because they needed to feed themselves. They needed to be able to work. But many also abandoned those marriages when they realized how patriarchal they were established to be. So I think understanding that and understanding where the church had a hand in promoting these kinds of arrangements is very important. I would also include a section on biblical hermeneutics related to the African American experience and related to popular interpretations of scripture that reinforce Euro-Western patriarchal constructions of marriage and family. And finally, I would address how the Bible has been weaponized at times to support sexual violation of girls, boys, and women, and some common misperceptions that God favors male dominance and female submission in the marital home. Honestly, Andrea, you've given me a new book idea. I mean, I would need a book really to work on these issues, but those are some of the things I would certainly talk about. I would say it's a theological issue because the church, first of all, a majority of Black people in this country are Christian, say that they're Christian on national surveys and things like that. And a large percentage, 56%, say that they read the Bible every day. So many Black people are getting married in churches, are being influenced by pastors and ministerial staff when they're preparing for marriage, right? Going through counseling sessions about how to engage in the marriage, how to have a strong and healthy marriage. And if these ministers have a perception of marriage that promote the dominance of husbands and the submission of wives, that's something that we really do need to address. So I would want to address that in a chapter or a book.
I can't wait for that book. I'm going to ask you two more questions, and if it's possible, give us quick responses so that we can hear quick questions from others. So just two more questions really quickly, and they're not small questions, so forgive me, but you offer some practical strategies for addressing the systemic issues of forbidden Black love. How would reparations address the problem? And then finally, I'll just ask you to address something that surprised me about the book. The title, of course, is Black Women, Black Love. And you take a pretty sympathetic approach to Black men, which surprised me. And there's a great deal of gender balance in how much you talk about men, how much you talk about women in the book. So I'd love to hear you tell us more about the sympathetic approach that you take to Black men.
Absolutely.
But yeah, because
I'll do them very quickly. So yes, I end up arguing that there are three major issues we must tackle if we're going to turn a corner on this problem. We must address inherited poverty and wealthlessness, a term I coined, wealthlessness. We must address the idealization of the patriarchal nuclear family, which I've just been talking about, and we must address colorism and other forms of phenotypic stratification. I just call it CPS, in the African American community and the wider nation and the wider society. Reparations would particularly impact inherited poverty and wealthlessness. You know, I actually draw on Dr. Derek Hamilton. He's an economist at the New School right there in New York City. I draw on his policy idea, his brainchild called baby bonds. And I think that would be a great place to start. It's just shy of being a reparations plan because it would impact everyone in the nation. But reparations, African American wealth was stolen for at least 10 generations. 10 generations. If we look at what the GI Bill did for modest and working class white families in just 1 or 2 generations, can you imagine where African Americans would be if their wealth had not been stolen for 10 generations? So reparations would be critical and crucial for that. And I'm so glad that it is a continued conversation in this era of awareness, deep awareness of anti-Black racism and violence in America. So to Black men, yes, I was just as surprised. I was just as surprised because there are actually a number of ways that one can consider where Black men are situated when it comes to the very low numbers of Black women who are married in America. And as I read through the materials, Andrea, I gathered that it was clear, really, that Black men had been severely victimized by forbidden Black love as well, right? Especially as it pertains to this paradox of patriarchy for Black men. Whenever it has been convenient for local, state, and federal governments to hold Black men accountable for patriarchal presence and provision for Black families, we have seen this expectation play out in government policies. However, at the same time, Black men have never been allowed to be patriarchs in America. For all of our history in America, most Black men have been locked out of the opportunities to provide adequately for their families. And so I expose episodes when this paradox has been most difficult. You can't miss it. For example, the Reconstruction era, the era of lynching, the thousands of Black men who were lynched because they were trying to be good patriarchs, set up businesses, provide for their families, lynched because they were economically viable, building their family's wealth. Right? So it's really important. Also, the period of when Black women begin to enter welfare programs in significant numbers, the late 50s and early 60s. Black male sexuality was policed. Black male opportunities for love were policed as much as Black women's were. So I thought it was very important to address this. And, I say in the book, we need to cultivate a new national affect regarding Black love and marriage, one that never forgets Zora Neale Hurston's vernacular theorization that the Black woman is the mule of the world, and one that simultaneously creates what Alicia Gaines calls empathy plus for Black men and Black males and their structural alienation from gainful employment as well as wealth building resources and opportunities.